This is College Football with Sam. Welcome back, everyone. I am so excited to go into this deep dive between the 8 seed Ohio State Buckeyes, who are 11-2, 7-2 in Big Ten Conference play, coming off of a resounding dominant win, 42-17 over the 9 seed Tennessee Volunteers, and the Oregon Ducks, who are the only undefeated team left in college football. They stand at 13-0, 9-0 in Big Ten play, and obviously, being the only undefeated team left in the country and the Big Ten champions, they have the number 1 seed. And this is a very special game, not just because it's between two of the best teams in the country. It's a rematch from what was the game of the year in the regular season. I also think that the traditional feeling of this game makes it special. The Rose Bowl in and of itself is the epitome of college football in many ways, and this Rose Bowl here is between two teams that have previously matched up before when it was a Big Ten versus Pac-12 affair, as it was for nearly its entire history in the Rose Bowl. Oregon and Ohio State have faced off multiple times before in the Rose Bowl, Oregon being a former Pac-12 team basically since the beginning of time, and same thing with Ohio State in regards to the Big Ten. They're both members of the Big Ten right now, but it's fitting that Ohio State, according to power ratings, is the best of the Big Ten teams from last season, and it's the same thing with Oregon in relationship to the Pac-12 teams of last season. So there's a lot of tradition packed into this game, or at least a lot of traditional elements, and there's also that modern feeling of the fact that the Rose Bowl game is a quarterfinal game. The winner of this game advances to play the winner of Texas-Arizona State, the Peach Bowl, in the Cotton Bowl. So the winner here, they don't exactly have an easy path to the national championship game, but a lot of people are talking about this game as if the winner of this is kind of a lock or close to a lock to go and play for a national championship, which I wouldn't underestimate Texas, but I understand where a lot of people are coming from. These are two of the best teams in college football, and I think that Oregon is a team who has gotten better as the season has gone on after their initial struggles. And the side of Ohio State that they showed against Tennessee is a team that I would say is nearly unstoppable. So we're going to talk about this game, preview it, give a prediction. I've already done a preview and prediction video, so if you want to check that out, the link is in the description or down below in the pinned comment. It's a more condensed version of this deep dive. Obviously, it's a shorter preview and prediction. This is my opinions and my thoughts on the Rose Bowl after I've watched some film, after I've looked into some more analytics, some more matchups, etc. So we're going to get into all of that. Before we do so, though, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share the video around. You want to hit the notification bell because we are doing deep dives on all of the quarterfinal games. Not just Ohio State versus Oregon for the Rose Bowl, but Penn State versus Boise State for the Fiesta Bowl, and then Georgia versus Notre Dame for the Sugar Bowl, and Texas versus Arizona State for the Peach Bowl. And we will also be doing even more videos, including some with guests, talking about more of our thoughts on the game and also reasons why specific teams will win specific matchups. So you will want to digest all of that. We also go live weekly to cover college football topics, react to current events like the transfer portal, for example. So you'll want to hit the notification bell so that you get notified when I go live or when I release videos, whether deep dives or other content. And we're also going to be doing play-by-play and color commentary for this game live while it is happening on College Football with Sam. Same with all the other quarterfinal games. So there's a lot of content this coming week. You won't want to miss it. So hit the notification bell, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. This week we will be doing a giveaway this week. So make sure to comment down below as that will be your entry for the giveaway. The giveaway is going to be a combo of things for 4 people. We are going to be giving merchandise of your choice along with a gift card. So that's going to be the giveaway for 4 people. You get that combo. Gift card will be an amount of $20, and then it'll be about the same in terms of a merchandise gift card so that you can purchase merchandise from my merchandise store. If you want to support the channel and the work we do here monetarily, speaking of the merchandise store, the link to that's in the description down below in the pinned comment. And also there's the Patreon page, link in the description or pinned comment, where you can sign up as a member. But just the free things, liking, sharing, subscribing, all those help us get into the algorithm, and I will be engaging with the comment section as always. But enough of that introduction, a little bit of a long-winded one, but I think it's necessary to talk about the traditions of this game, what's at stake here, many people believing that this is, in fact, the de facto national championship game, and there's also a lot of content that I wanted to make you all aware of for this coming week, especially leading up to the quarterfinals. So my original prediction here was Oregon 31, Ohio State 24. That was my initial prediction. And the thought process behind it was many little things play Oregon's way when you look at this matchup. Ohio State has some very impressive non-negotiables. They have Jeremiah Smith at wide receiver. They have Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, and Brandon Innes also in that rotation. Smith is the face of the wide receiver room, a little bit of Egbuka too, but they have more than just one or two elite players there. And Oregon's defensive back core, well, I think it's good. In fact, I think it's great, maybe near elite. Maybe some of their players even are elite. They don't have a non-negotiable or alien player in that secondary, which Ohio State's secondary does in Caleb Downs. And Lathan Ransom also grades out to be that caliber of athlete, that caliber of player per Pro Football Focus, and also his own personal statistics and watching the film. That's a big area of advantage for Ohio State. But Oregon, what they have is they all around have better depth, I believe. A lot of that's due to the injuries that Ohio State has incurred, so not necessarily something that Ohio State can control. But there's also the controllable fact that they've recruited better at the offensive line compared to Ohio State. They're much deeper there, even if Ohio State's offensive line was perfectly healthy. And Oregon, as I mentioned earlier, they have one of the better secondaries in football. Their wide receiver core is right up there with Ohio State's. They don't have a Jeremiah Smith caliber player, but they're very deep. They have a lot of different body types, different skill sets in that wide receiver room. They're much better and deeper at tight end. Their running back room is deep. Dylan Gabriel is about the same as Will Howard, or grades out to be slightly better, depending on where you look. And they have great players all around on defense, similar with Ohio State. And they have more reliable kicking, more reliable punting. Their special teams are better. So while there are some big things, don't get me wrong, there are many big things that go Ohio State's way in this matchup. There are some little things, many little things that go Oregon's way. And the thought process was that those things, some of the little things are not actually little things, like trench play. Trench play is a big thing. These things snowball as the matchup goes on, and that helps Oregon to win in a close 31-24 affair. Oregon wins the trenches. Ohio State wins the air game. This is kind of how it happened in the first matchup. Yeah, Oregon got a lot of big passing plays through the air in Ohio State, but Will Howard had the better completion percentage. It felt like Ohio State's passing attack was more sustainable than Oregon's, but Oregon's rushing attack was far more sustainable than Ohio State's was in that game. It will be a tight, magical game. It will be back and forth. It will be decided in the fourth quarter. And overall, Oregon's aggression and more balanced roster and depth helps them win. So that was my original prediction. But that was my original prediction. So what has changed since I've watched film, since I have studied analytics more, and just looked at different things and different matchups here? I want to kick this off by doing what we always do and looking at a bigger picture here. Not just my perspective, but outsider perspectives as well. So, Football Power Index has Ohio State winning this game by about 1.5 points. It's actually wider than that if you act like the Rose Bowl is a true neutral field, and maybe it is, but Oregon plays in the same time zone as the Rose Bowl. The Pac-12 teams have a slightly better winning percentage than the Big Ten teams, and Ohio State, only about 10 days before this matchup takes place, just played Tennessee at home in a different environment. Oregon has been in a more similar environment for much longer, and they're coming off of a longer period of rest, the same period of rest that Ohio State had before they played Tennessee. And look how that benefited Ohio State. That's because Ohio State is a good coaching staff and good players, so they put, with a elite scheme, those good players in a position to win. We have to assume that Oregon will probably do the same thing here. I think that the travel benefits Oregon a little bit, so I gave them some points for FPI. But regardless of that, FPI still picks Ohio State to win because their power rated is the best team in the Big Ten. For S&P Plus, Ohio State and Oregon are number 1 and number 2. Ohio State's a little bit less than 1 point better, so I gave Oregon again some points for the travel and being in a more similar environment. So, and I did this because I know that these models do give different bonuses depending on travel time or home field advantage, but I just don't know exactly what they were, so I gave a basic field goal advantage. Just wanted to clarify that there. S&P Plus, with that in mind, has Oregon winning by about 2.1 points, or favored by 2.1 points. Kelly Ford, with that in mind, Ohio State's favored by 0.7 points to win. College Football Insiders, straight up, this was without factoring anything in because this is more of a predictive model, not just a power rating. College Football Insiders from Parker Fleming has Oregon winning by 1.8 points. College Football Nerds, they don't adjust for home field advantage or anything like that, but I didn't mess with their model because it's a predictive model that's one of the most accurate in the country, so I just wanted to leave that alone. They have Ohio State winning by 8.9 points. My potential power index is Oregon winning by 8 points. So, yeah. There's a lot of variability with these power ratings, and by variability I mean in terms of who's being picked to win. Everyone is picking this game to be a single-digit game for the winner, where it will be close for 3 quarters at the very least, 4 quarters at the most. It wouldn't shock me at all if this game went into overtime, similar to last year's Rose Bowl where Michigan beat Alabama 27-20. These teams are close. And Ohio State's been power rated top 3, top 4 for pretty much the entire year. Oregon started out actually ahead of Ohio State in preseason FPI, but their game against Idaho caused them to fall like 8 points, and probably in FPI terms, or 8 placements, and anywhere from I think 5 to sometimes even close to 10 points, if my memory serves me correctly, in football power index rating. The Boise State game didn't help either, and even though Oregon has clearly rebounded from that, at one point they were outside the top 10 in FPI, it's been a slow climb up because they have not dominated a lot of their opponents, especially their better opponents in terms of points. So I think the Idaho and Boise State games are still holding Oregon a little bit back in the power ratings. Ohio State's had some rough games, and they're still very high up there. So these are some of the better teams in the country, and that's what the analytics are telling us. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at how dominant each team is here. So Ohio State is still one of the most dominant teams in the country. And I say so with a little bit of a pause because at 11-2, 7-2, losing to the Michigan team that they did, you may not think of this Ohio State team as dominant, but the reality is when you have a points per play margin of 0.386, which means you're outscoring your opponents by 0.386 points per one of your plays compared to one of their average plays, that means on a game-per-game basis, you are blowing out your opponents. You're breaking them, with the exception of the Ohio State-Nebraska game where Nebraska just had that much more plays and still lost. Wasn't a dominant victory for Ohio State. It was a dominant performance in points per play margin because Ohio State scored more points off of far fewer plays compared to Nebraska. But in general, a large points per play margin like that tells you that on an average basis, this is one of the better teams in the country, one of the more dominant teams in the country, especially when you see that at the bottom of your screen here, Ohio State's second in game control, they're third in average in-game win probability, and they're a very impressive team. Make no mistake about it. I mean, they are straight up second in points per play margin. They're fourth in points per play. They're ahead of Oregon in both those things. But Oregon's fourth in points per play margin. 0.272. And when you look at the expected points added margin, these are top 10 teams as well. They're Oregon, 0.227 expected points added margin. That means they do a much better job of moving down the field to put their team in scoring position and also preventing their opponents from moving down the field and putting themselves into scoring position than their opponents do in those areas. Ohio State has a 0.281 expected points added margin. When you look at yards per point margin, which is really similar to points per play margin, except it has a lot more to do with field position and special teams. It's why Iowa is always ranked high in this category. Ohio State has a 9.4 yards per point margin. Oregon has a 5 yards per point margin. The average scoring margin of these teams, for Ohio State's plus 24.6 per game. For Oregon, it's 18.8 points per game. You look at yards per play margin, that's just how many yards per play does your offense gain, subtracted by how much does your defense allow. Ohio State is a plus 2.8 yards per play margin, Oregon with a plus 1.9. What's interesting in looking at these teams is their success rates, which is how often does your offense or defense win the play-per-play battle. For Oregon, their offense has a 48.9 offensive success rate, which is better than Ohio State's 47.4%, but both are very high. You look at the defenses here. Ohio State's defense only allows a 34.8 defensive success rate, which is elite. Oregon's at 37.3% is near elite, but not quite as good as Ohio State's there. These teams' identities for Oregon, it's a little bit more offensive. For Ohio State, it's definitely on the defensive side of the ball. Oregon is 4th in game control. Ohio State is 2nd. So even when you adjust for strength of schedule, when you look at how these teams are in terms of dominance and performance week to week, game per game, they're both top 4, top 5, very similar there. And Ohio State's 3rd in average in-game win probability per ESPN's FPI. Oregon is 2nd. Now I want to get more into kind of my own analysis and what I have learned from watching film and just combining that with some of the opinions that I had previously. Of course, willing to change my mind, and in some areas, in fact, I did change my mind. So let's get to this right now. And first and foremost, I want to talk about coaching and some position battles, and then talk about just straight up players and the depth chart here. So for head coach, I got to go with Dan Lanning over Ryan Day. And a huge part of this is not just the fact that Lanning has won the Big Ten 13-0, 9-0, and he beat Ryan Day head-to-head. This also has to do with the fact that I think that he has constructed his roster and coaching staff in a superior way compared to Ryan Day. I think that overall, looking at the offensive and defensive staffs, the strength and conditioning, when you average out the two staffs here that these coaches have built, I think that Lanning has been more aggressive. I think that Lanning has made the better hires overall. I think that Lanning is a better manager of games. Now, I think Ryan Day in the aggregate is still a pretty good, great game manager. But that first game, where in watching it again, I think that Oregon was the more boomer bust team in that matchup. They were a little bit more inconsistent, driving down, failing on that 4th and goal where Dylan Gabriel, that wide open wide receiver, should have been a touchdown. Wasn't. Great stop by Ohio State. Oregon had the missed field goal. Oregon, they had the interception where it was ruled a catch by the refs for Kaz Merrick, and Ohio State was smart enough to quickly get up to the line and take advantage of that. But Oregon also had highs in the game where they had that onside kick recovery. They had several big plays through the air. This has less to do with variance, just their identity and how they've built their team. But they had the better ground game. Ohio State, meanwhile, was pretty consistent throughout the whole game, just killing Oregon, picking them apart through the passing game, and not much else. Like, not many misfires outside of the Quinshon Judkins fumble, but I think a lot of that is on the O-line and just how good of a player Derek Harmon was. And their offensive line was pretty consistent too. Better in pass block than run block. Seth McLaughlin was just killing people in that game. And I'm getting a little bit too carried away in that regard. But the point being, Lanning was the much better coach, and compensated for a lot of the inconsistencies that his team had in the first matchup. Whereas Day just, I don't know, got to give credit where credit's due for Ohio State being consistent in that game. But ultimately, some of the decisions that he made in that game, I feel like not trusting his kicker. I know that Jaden Fielding against Michigan, bit of a different story, but he made one from 40 in that game, and just, I think in that moment, it would have been better to just, we'll continue driving down the field and not, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong there, and maybe I'm overthinking it. But combining that with the way that, these teams both played Penn State, with the way that they have played their lower level competition, I have more trust in Lanning than Ryan Day. I think that Will Stein, speaking of the offensive staff, is better than Chip Kelly, but I do think that Jim Knowles is a much better defensive coordinator with a better defensive staff than what Tosh Lupoy has at Oregon. In run blocking, pass blocking, run offense, pass defense, obviously, I think that we can all agree Oregon is better in those areas, with the exception of maybe the passing offense. Because Ohio State, as we'll talk about in a few seconds, has some very elite wide receivers and a quarterback in Will Howard who I think is still underrated nationally. Ohio State averages 0.568 points per play on offense. Oregon averages 0.546. When you look at running the football, Oregon averages 4.9 yards per carry, which is 29th. Ohio State averages 5 yards per carry, which is 27th. But I've tracked this. When you take out the non-conference opponents that these two teams have played, Oregon, FCS, Idaho, Boise State, and also Oregon State, and for Ohio State, Marshall, Akron, Western Michigan, since the start of Big Ten Conference play, including the Big Ten Championship game for Oregon and the Tennessee game for Ohio State's only averaged 4.4 yards per carry and 146.4 yards per game. Oregon's averaged 184.9 rushing yards per game and 5.1 yards per carry. And the reason I did that is because against Boise State and against Idaho, Oregon had Charlie Picard at center, not Iapani Lololu, and they had some other injuries on the O-line that they were working through. Figured a little bit of a slow start. This Oregon team's different in a lot of key areas compared to that Oregon team. I'm going to take those out. And also those teams, all in all, were more inferior to Oregon in the grand scheme of things than many Big Ten opponents. It's the same thing with Ohio State. Those non-conference opponents are inferior to Ohio State in almost every way. And that Ohio State team in September was different than the one right now. I mean, they had Josh Simmons. They had Seth McLaughlin. And I think the difference between these two teams from September and even from their first matchup in October until now, they're not stark because they have a lot of the same players, obviously, but there are some differences here. And I think that Oregon, even though the stats may not say they have the clearly better rushing offense, I think when you adjust for certain things and when you watch how these two teams play, I do think Oregon has the much better rushing offense than what Ohio State has. In terms of passing offense, these teams are both top 10 in yards per pass attempt, but outside the top 40 in yards per completion. They're content with getting explosives when they get them, but more often than not, they just utilize checkdowns and intermediate passes to keep opposing defenses honest and to slowly pick them apart. In rushing defense, Ohio State, you got to go with them. Same thing in pass defense. And when I look at outside edge and inside edge, a lot of that has to do with pass rush and more so the play on the front. How do you do at getting pressure from the outside or stopping plays on the outside versus the inside? I go with Ohio State on both, and this is something that my mind changed on a bit. I was originally going to go with Oregon on the inside edge, but after watching film of these two teams, I couldn't ignore mostly Ohio State's linebacker room and also safety room, and how those rooms, as we'll discuss in a few seconds, are better than Oregon at those positions, even though I think Oregon has the better defensive tackles. Overall, Ohio State's defense is clearly the better defense compared to Oregon's, and I think it's the same way with Oregon offensively compared to Ohio State's offense. The Buckeyes have more X-Factor players. Maybe Oregon, if we're only talking about X-Factor players, might have more, but as we've discussed on the channel, we also talk about alien players who count as X-Factors but are even a bigger X-Factor, an unusual X-Factor, something that you will have a hard time stopping or moving. And Ohio State has more alien players with a similar or maybe even greater amount of X Factor players, even with the injuries on the offensive line. So I give that to Ohio State. But Oregon, I believe, has more reliable depth. And we've already talked about that, so I'm not going to go much further into detail there. One quick note on the rushing defenses. I adjusted as well, removing the first 3 non-conference games from these teams' schedules. Ohio State allows 112 rushing yards per game and 3.3 yards per carry if you take out those first 3 games. For Oregon, I know that for Oregon that may be a little bit more foolish because they did play GT in the non-conference, but then again, GT is unlike anything Oregon is going to see for the rest of the season unless they rematch with Boise State because he's that special. Oregon has only allowed 3.9 rushing yards per carry since the start of Big Ten Conference play up until this point, and 132.4 rushing yards per game allowed. So even when you factor out those first 3 games, unlike the rushing offenses where it's clear when you factor out those non-conference games, Oregon's clearly better at rushing offense. For rushing defense, the teams converge a little bit in Oregon's direction, but Ohio State is still clearly, I would say, the better rushing defense. Quarterback, I would take Dylan Gabriel over Will Howard. At running back, Jordan James, I think, is an elite running back, and I think that he's a running back that individually you might rather have than either of Ohio State's 2, although I'm not going to say that definitively because I like Travion Henderson, so we'll just put them in the same category with different skill sets. But Quinshon Judkins for Ohio State gives them more depth, so I would take Ohio State's running back room right now. For wide receiver, I would take Ohio State too with Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Brandon Innocent, and Emeka Egbuka over Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden, Gary Bryant Jr., and Evan Stewart. At tight end, this is probably the easiest one to pick outside of maybe center and tackle. You got Kenyon Sadiq and you have Terrence Ferguson. It's pretty easy to choose them over G. Scott Jr., Jelani Thurman, and Will Kazmarek. For center, if Seth McLaughlin was healthy right now, it would be very easy to pick him at center. But sadly, he's not. Be praying for his recovery. I hope that he has a lot of success in the NFL. Watching him versus watching Hinsman on film and just the power that they provide, very stark difference there. A huge downgrade at center, in my opinion. And that's no disrespect to Hinsman. I think Hinsman is probably an overhated center, and a lot of blame was put on him for last year's issues when that was just not fair. But McLaughlin's a much better center. And Iapani Lololu for Oregon is a better center than Carson Hinsman. At guard, Oregon has had some health issues at guard throughout the year. This has been their worst position on the offensive line. However, I do believe that whether it is Nishad Strother, Marcus Harper II, whoever is starting at guard, they've had a rotation there. I think they're better right now than Tegra Shabola, Luke Montgomery, Austin Sierreveld in that rotation. For tackle, Josh Connerly Jr. and Johnny Cornelius superior to Josh Fryer and also to Donovan Jackson, who's pushed out to left tackle since the tragic injury to Josh Simmons. Be praying for him as well. At D tackle, this one's close, but I do prefer Derek Harmon and Jamari Caldwell and Amari Washington over Ohio State's Ty Hamilton and Tyleik Williams. Tyleik Williams and Derek Harmon are my favorite players amongst these 2 defensive tackle units. They're the best right there. But Jamari Caldwell has graded out to be a much better nose tackle than Ty Hamilton has this season. For defensive end, I do think that Oregon is better in pass rush here. I think that Birch and Uyunglele are better pass rushers slightly than Tuimoloau and Sawyer, but I do think that Sawyer and Tuimoloau are even better rush defensive ends than Birch and Uyunglele. So for that reason, I give Ohio State defensive end. Linebacker, this one was not as easy as, let's say, the O-line or tight end for Oregon, but I love Cody Simon. He's been one of the best linebackers in the country this year, and Sonny Styles has been good. Bryce Betcher and Jeffrey Bossa have also been good, but not at the same level that Simon has been. So I give Ohio State linebacker. At corner, Jabbar Muhammad and also Nico Reed, I've been very impressed by, especially Nico Reed. Now, some might say that Ohio State's corners are overhated, and I think they're good. But believe me when I say, and I'll show you in a few seconds here, Oregon's corners grade out very high, and they do not have the lows that Ohio State's do. Not one bit. They don't have the same penalties. They don't have the same gaffes in coverage. I just have to go with Oregon here at corner. But the reason why Ohio State's better in pass defense, perhaps much better than Oregon, is their safety room. Jordan Hancock, Caleb Downs, Lathan Ransom are, I would say, perhaps the biggest reason why Ohio State has been one of the best teams in the country this year. All three of those players are some of the best safeties in the country, particularly Ransom and Downs. They are superior to Oregon's safety room, which I think is good, but overall, Tysheem Johnson, Kobe Savage, and Brandon Johnson I do not trust as well as those three. In terms of special teams, Oregon does have the better punting and kicking and also return units. Let's check out some matchups here, just very, very briefly. On the screen, you see the Pro Football Focus grades assigned to the different positions for these teams on the field. We're looking at Oregon's defense versus Ohio State's offense. We're looking at that matchup first. Some takeaways that I had for this, being Ohio State's offense versus Oregon's defense. When you look at trench play and the rushing offense in the short game, Oregon overall has about a 9 assigned point advantage in terms of Pro Football Focus grades. Ohio State's offensive line versus Oregon's defensive line. The average grade of Ohio State's offensive lineman versus Oregon's defensive lineman is 11 points in favor of the Ducks here. The Ducks do have a pretty fantastic matchup edge with their defensive line versus the Ohio State offensive line. Carson Hinsman has the lowest grade of any player for Ohio State's offensive line at center with a 58. And Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon are both in the mid 70s per Pro Football Focus. It seems like it will be a similar case as the first matchup around, where Ohio State's pass blocking, looking at their tackles here, who are the highest graded players in the O-line, Josh Fryer and Donovan Jackson, the pass blocking for Ohio State will have a much easier time than their run blocking at following through on their assignments. The guards and center for Ohio State, and I've been saying this for a while, I even said it before the injuries occurred, the run blocking is still not as good as the pass blocking. And there have been some people who have defended Justin Fry. There's nothing to defend because all these players starting right now, I believe outside of maybe Saraveld, were high caliber 4 stars or 5 stars coming out of high school. If anything, it's their raw talent that's preventing this O-line from totally collapsing. Not anything to do with development. I'm telling you. Seth McLaughlin and Josh Simmons, the injuries were tragic because they covered up a lot of holes in this line. I mean, I'm watching McLaughlin against Oregon, rewatching, and he's maybe he'll give up some leverage temporarily, but then he holds steady or pushes his man back. It was especially the case against Penn State, him against Devon J. Thomas and Zane Durant. He was dominating them. And then against Oregon and Michigan and even Tennessee, you did not see that same push consistently from the center position, if at all from the interior. So that's something to watch out for right there. I will say, though, that Ohio State's running backs grade out very favorably, Henderson and Judkins. They actually grade out on an average basis when looking at them against Oregon's linebackers and safeties. They grade out 13 points better. Now, Pro Football Focus doesn't grade all positions equally, and of course there's a larger sample of Oregon's linebackers and safeties than Ohio State's running backs because there are more players. But Ohio State's running backs do a very good job of compensating for the offensive line too, especially Travion Henderson. He'll make a few people miss, pick up a few extra yards, sometimes get a big gain on the ground. Judkins really has not been able to compensate for the offensive line outside of being a power back and falling forward maybe a yard or two additional after every time that he's contacted. Ohio State's tight ends don't match up well with Oregon in terms of blocking or in terms of receiving. Ohio State's tight ends, they can be a very important part of the offense, don't get me wrong, especially because of how athletic they are, but Oregon does a very good job in coverage, as we've already talked about here. The real matchup edge for Ohio State in all of this, as you can tell by the grades, Oregon matches up very favorably in the trenches with Ohio State, both in the run game and also in terms of even pass rush. It's a little favorable for Oregon, certainly more favorable than it was the first time around. when you look at the passing offense, these wide receivers for Ohio State, especially Jeremiah Smith, that 86, tied for the highest graded position, wide receiver X you see there. That's Jeremiah Smith, his position with the running backs. They have an edge in the passing game, Ohio State does, against this Oregon defense, especially their wide receivers. Jabbar Muhammad and also Nico Reed. And Jabbar Muhammad is the baseline corner. Nico Reed is I think it's the field side corner. They're good. They're some of the better cornerbacks in the nation. But as you can see, the safeties are not graded as high as the cornerbacks are for Oregon. And I think in a sense that played out in the first matchup where Ohio State was able to get some pretty consistent, not 50-yard or 75-yard passes, but they were getting more than checkdowns or completed slants where they beat their man. They were finding holes in the zone, not just 5 or 10 yards down the field, but many times 20 or even 30 yards down the field. I think that Oregon has an advantage here in run defense, an advantage in terms of, I'd say, pass rush versus pass protection, though that's slight. It's not very big. But they have an advantage, the Buckeyes do, in terms of just straight up passing the football. So I think that similar to the first matchup, Ohio State will have a very hard time running the football. Oregon will probably get more pressure on Ohio State than Ohio State will on Oregon, which we'll talk about in a few seconds. But Ohio State shouldn't have much of a problem getting, 200. I mean, they'll obviously get 200, but like 250 or even 300 passing yards. They should be able to pass on this Oregon secondary and defense and use that to methodically move down the field and sort of pass in a rushing type way where they can pass short with their athletes to compensate for that lack of a ground game. They did that against Oregon, by the way. There's this play where I thought Will Howard should have been picked off by, I believe, Nico Reed or Jabbar Muhammad, who ran the screen play correctly. But instead, Jeremiah Smith caught it, and using his athleticism and his physicality as one of the most physical receivers in football, he gained more than 5 yards. In fact, I think he may have picked up a first down on that. Ohio State can make those type of plays. They can compensate for their lack of a ground game, if indeed they can't run the ball, because maybe they will. I mean, Henderson's a non-negotiable. He can, and maybe I'll even say will make a big play happen in this game on the ground, at least one of them. I'd lean toward that being the case. Now let's look at Oregon's offense versus Ohio State's defense. As clear as day, I think the first things that jump out to me here are Dylan Gabriel, 90 grade at QB, and then you got Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs right there at strong safety and free safety for Ohio State at an 88 and 86, respectively. And keep in mind, all these positions are weighted. I've included the 2 deep in exclusively all of these positions except for maybe center. That's basically the only one where I didn't include a 2 deep right here. And even with their backups weighing them down, they're close to 90s, which is an insanely high grade for Lathan Ransom and also for Caleb Downs. That's the best safety duo in the country. No one's close. And you factor in Jordan Hancock, who's in the 70s but weighed down by his backup, Lorenzo Styles Jr., I think that's easily the best safety room in the country, and no one's really close for Ohio State. You compare this to Oregon's receivers, and Tez Johnson, wide receiver F there, the slot guy, he's really the only one that grades out high enough to where you know that he's going to make a big play. Evan Stewart in that first game came on and had a great day, but outside of maybe one other game, he has not been all that consistent this year. It's the same with Trayshawn Holden. Stewart's their main guy. Same with Terrence Ferguson and Kenyon Sadiq, who are both factored at tight end, 77. You look at the offensive line versus Ohio State's defensive line, and there are some interesting things. Sawyer and Tui Mo'olau, both graded very highly, and very similarly to Oregon, they will probably have a pass rush advantage. Ohio State will on Oregon's offense in the same way that Oregon's defense did on Ohio State's offense, at least in terms of the edge. But you look on the interior, and outside of right guard, 53, he's in the 50s, like Carson Hinsman at center. That's the guard position with Nishad Strother, who's had some injuries in the past month or so. Oregon's offensive line is much more highly graded than OSU's is, particularly at offensive tackle and center. Meanwhile, Ohio State's D tackles are not graded as highly as Oregon's. And I think that something I came away with from that first Oregon game is that Sawyer and Tuimoloau did a better job on the edge getting pressure. They didn't really get pressure. The tackles did very well, but at times they're able to get close. But then Dillon Gabriel threw the ball, and he's a very aware quarterback, more so than even Will Howard, who's very aware. So they sometimes compensate for their offensive line. What was stark in that game is how I think Oregon's interior O-line did a very good job locking up Ohio State's interior defensive line, with the exception of goal line situations. And of course, the linebackers and safeties playing closer to the line of scrimmage in those positions and adding in extra defensive linemen make the job of the D-line easier in that part of the field. So looking at how these two rosters here, Ohio State's defense and Oregon's offense match up, I think what's interesting is that Oregon should be able to protect their QB a little bit better and run the football pretty well too. But the safeties for Ohio State and the linebackers for Ohio State, they're better than Oregon at those positions. And corner, you have a 70, that's Denzel Burke. The 67 for right corner is Igmanosin. The corners do play a big role in how this matchup goes here. If they have the same game that they did last time against Oregon, or at least similar, or they don't play to their ceiling, perhaps, because all season long they've had issues defending the pass. The difference is most of the receivers, in fact, all of the receivers that Ohio State's defense has faced off against outside of Oregon don't come close to Oregon, to be frank, with maybe the exception of Tyler Warren, and he's a tight end, best tight end in the Big Ten, but he's not a wide receiver. He's a tight end at different positions with some similar characteristics. The corners determine a lot for Ohio State. And also, I'd say the linebackers do too, because Oregon is going to utilize their tight ends who are good in both blocking and also good at catching the ball. I mean, Kenyon Sadiq, I think, has the potential to be a freak athlete, and Terrence Ferguson is very reliable. There's also the fact that Dillon Gabriel has a ground element to him and can scramble out of the pocket or perform at a high level in designed runs, in zone reads. So looking at this right here, I think that Oregon will run the ball a little bit better than Ohio State. They'll pass block better than Ohio State. They don't have the same type of advantage through the air, though, that Ohio State does, where Ohio State has a pretty solid, sizable edge with their receivers and QB against Oregon's secondary. It's not exactly the case here. Oregon does have some advantages, I think, against the corners and also against the linebacker room as a whole. Simon's good, but you also have to remember he's not the only linebacker, and I think outside of him, Oregon's tight ends are better than Ohio State's linebackers. But Oregon's pass offense, I think, relies a bit more on their O-line to work than Ohio State's does, solely because of the mismatches roster-wise. So if Ohio State's pass rush is on and they're able to get to Dillon Gabriel, that can create a lot of problems for Oregon. Even if Oregon is able to get to Will Howard fairly often, they still have to deal with the fact that Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka are probably better than anyone who's covering them, and therefore they can still make plays. And I think that's something that was very apparent in the first game. Oregon actually got a fair amount of pressure at times. It wasn't a good amount, but it was fair. It didn't affect the offense that much, because by the time they were able to get to Howard, there was someone open, or someone in a one-on-one position where Jeremiah Smith or Egbuka was likely to win. Let's talk about the good, meh, and ugly for Ohio State. Let's breeze through these, get to my final prediction. The good here, Ohio State has athletes everywhere, just straight up, and they're deep. Most position groups have an elite two deep, where they can substitute if they choose to. It's something that Ohio State hasn't done a whole lot, but if they choose to, they can substitute in, and there won't be that much of a drop-off. They have elite tackling, football IQ, and pursuit at defensive back and linebacker. I think Ohio State has the best defensive backfield of anyone in the nation, and again, it's not particularly close. Will Howard is a great field general and playmaker. Yes, he makes, I'd say, anywhere from 2 to 5 dumb decisions per game, but that's it. And everything else is a good to even elite decision or play on an average basis. The running backs are the full package, and they compensate for the offensive line. Jeremiah Smith, 1,037 receiving yards, 16.5 yards per catch, and 12 touchdowns. He, along with Ibuka, Tate, and Innis, they're all NFL caliber. Neutrals, the meh for this team, of the defensive line. I'd say this should be a positive, but in a matchup like this, it's a meh because of how good Oregon's O-line is. They're very boom and bust in the defense and the play that they provide. Against Penn State, an offensive line that moved Oregon around, maybe it's more so on Penn State than Ohio State in that game. But Ohio State's D-line, I noticed from the jump, and I didn't notice it in the first matchup until later in the game. From the jump, they were out physicaling Penn State's offensive line, like straight up from the jump. It's why Penn State couldn't run the football on them. But then you look at like the Oregon game or the Michigan game. The Michigan game, they did pretty good in run defense, but they could not get to the quarterback at all. And they've been up and down all season long. And outside of Sawyer, I don't think they have a potential non-negotiable player on the D-line as well. Remember, Ohio State, their D-line, and this was before the Tennessee game, so keep that in mind. But I think the Tennessee game is kind of the exception to the rule because of how bad their tackles were. They barely account for like 60% of their pressures. Knowles has to bring linebackers to get pressure on opposing QBs, and that can be a problem, especially against an offense like the one they're going to face in the Rose Bowl. The cornerbacks, their technique is questionable. I don't understand why Igmanosin holds the way he does. That is a personal issue or a coaching issue. I don't understand why Burke has the struggles in coverage that he does. Again, either a personal issue or coaching issue, but they are talented and can make plays at times. The ugly for the Buckeyes is their lack of rotation and depth, especially up front, can be crippling. Now, they did more rotations against Tennessee, even on the offensive line, but you got to keep in mind that these things stack. Oregon has done a better job throughout the whole season at rotating. That means their entire roster is more seasoned on an average basis than Ohio State does. Therefore, another game-ending injury for an Ohio State player might be more devastating than that for an Oregon player, depending on the position, of course, because Ohio State has elite two-deeps at a variety of positions, but it's something to keep in mind. And the offensive line is just blatantly, it's bad. It's awful. And people were, sharing highlights of Luke Montgomery, for example, like pancaking an Ohio State, or not an Ohio State, but a Tennessee D lineman. Congratulations. There's a reason that's the only play being shared, because Henderson carried the rushing attack outside of that. They did well in pass blocking. That I will give credit to. But you have to understand, with the skill position talent that Ohio State has, this offensive line is one of the easier jobs out of any offensive line in the country. And yet, ever since non-conference play ended, they're struggling to run for 4 yards per carry. And against elite D lines like Michigan, Howard gets pressured on more snaps than he doesn't. The skill talent masks this offensive line's critical weaknesses. If Ohio State wins the national championship, which they very well could, and their fan base should expect them to, Fry should still be fired. I mean, it's unbelievably bad how the job that he's done on the offensive line. Even with just some of the injuries that have happened, the talent that he still has right now in the current starting lineup should be better developed. It should, but it isn't, alas. The good for Oregon is that the Ducks have no real glaring weaknesses. I know that people have harped on their rushing defense, but let me read you this, and I'll read it for Ohio State too. It's the same thing with Ohio State's passing defense, by the way. Ohio State and Oregon, the reason their rushing defenses and passing defenses aren't statistically as good as one might expect is because they have faced some very impressive for Oregon rushing offenses and for Ohio State passing offenses. Ohio State's passing offense throughout the season has allowed 141.2 passing yards per game, which is borderline elite, and 5.6 yards per attempt through the air. You factor out the Oregon game, which Oregon, I think, has potentially the best passing offense in the country when it's on. Ohio State's only allowed 124.6 passing yards per game and 5.1 yards per attempt without the Oregon game. That's insane. Now, they have to make sure they do well against Oregon, of course, otherwise they don't win at all, and the season is a failure. But this secondary, the secondary is elite, guys. The corners are good. They're not near elite or elite. They might be great. But the safety room's generational, and that really helps, and they have a good scheme as well from Jim Knowles, who's one of the best DCs in the country. Going back to Oregon, though, flipping on the other side of my paper where I took all these notes and different things, Oregon has allowed 132.7 rushing yards per game throughout the season, all 13 games, for 4.1 yards per carry. It's not that good. It's average, might be above average when you factor in their schedule, but it's not great. When you factor out Boise State, who has Ginty, and Ginty runs on everyone, his O-line looked good against Oregon at times, but there were also multiple times where Oregon got push on his D-line and Ginty just made things happen. And then also against Penn State, where Penn State's O-line hasn't looked or produced a game that dominant all season long outside of like Kent State, so I think there may have been some flukish elements there, just a little bit, but maybe there wasn't. There's also the fact that regardless of that, Penn State is one of the best rushing attacks in the Big Ten. I think it's, at this point, the best rushing offense in the Big Ten, and Oregon won't face a rushing offense like that unless they rematch with Penn State in the Natty or they play Notre Dame in the Natty. Without those two games, Oregon's only allowed 109.7 rushing yards per game and 3.4 yards per carry. So I rest my case. I don't think Oregon's rushing defense is a weakness. I think it's a good rushing defense, maybe great. It's not near elite, not elite. It's like Ohio State's corner room, which Ohio State's corner room might be a weak link on the defense, but it's not weak nationally. Like, let's say Ohio State's O-line is, which is a below-average Power 4, if not worse, offensive line. They're fantastic in coverage. They have depth in the secondary. They have an elite pass rush and good tackling from the D-line and linebackers. Oregon has 40 sacks on the year. A lot of that does come from their D-line. And they're physical in the trenches. I mean, they're 10th in opponent yards per carry in the Big Ten, which isn't good. They're 5th in yards per carry, which is good. But we've already talked about they've played an unusually good amount of elite running backs, including Henderson, including Judkins from the first time around. And they faced a lot of good rushing offenses. They have explosive athletes at running back and wide receiver. And Dylan Gabriel's a lot like Will Howard. Veteran QB with tricks up his sleeve, makes good plays. He has an 86.7 QBR on the year. The neutral for Oregon is their special teams as upside, but it's also pretty inconsistent. Their rushing attack is powerful, but it does lack explosion. They've only averaged 4.9 yards per carry on the year, even when you factor out their struggles in non-conference play with the ground game before their O-line got healthy. They're still only averaging 5.1 yards per carry. A lot of Oregon's rushing attack is just anywhere from really 3 to 20 yards per carry, and the 20 yards per carry are pretty rare. Happen every so often, maybe once or twice a game. But Oregon's rushing attack is more like Michigan's last year than Oregon's last year, where you just slowly beat your opponents to death and wear them down. You don't really get a lot of explosives, which is good, but it's also sort of you wish you had the explosives. The ugly for Oregon is they're inconsistent in the red zone. They're 49th in red zone conversion percentage on offense. 93rd on defense is an area where Ohio State is stronger than Oregon in, showed in the first matchup. And the Ducks don't have a Jeremiah Smith or Caleb Downs. Connerly Jr. might be an alien player. Johnson has some alien characteristics at wide receiver. Harmon does at D tackle. And I think Kenyon Sadiq might at tight end. But they're still not quite that insane generational talent that Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs clearly are. So even if Oregon may have some depth and not the same weaknesses that Ohio State does, Ohio State has players with upsides that Oregon wish they had and will have in the future, but right now I don't think they do. So now let's talk about 10 reasons why these teams will win. Go through them very quickly. We'll get to my updated prediction here. For Ohio State, number 1 is Caleb Downs, Lathan Ransom, Jordan Hancock. Number 2 is their NFL caliber wide receiver room. Number 3 is defensive coordinator Jim Knowles and the adjustments he's made since the first matchup. Number 4 is Ohio State's advantages through the air. They have a mismatch there against Oregon. Number 5 is their explosive linebackers who get pressure, are very good at tackling and reading offenses. Number 6 is an experienced and strong defensive line. 7 is Will Howard. 8th is Travion Henderson. 9th is their superior red zone efficiency. And 10th is the fact that it's hard to beat a good team twice. So even if Oregon, let's say it's similar as the first time around and they outgain Ohio State and they win the turnover battle, and maybe, let's even say maybe they're even the better team, it's hard to beat a good team twice, and that plays to Ohio State's advantage here. Number 1 for Oregon is their elite NFL offensive line. Number 2 is they have a mismatch in the trenches that goes their way. 3rd is offensive coordinator Will Stein, who worked Jim Knowles the last time, so he can this time around, and he's one of the best OCs in the country, so he definitely can again. Number 4 is their strong and explosive defensive line. 5th is Dylan Gabriel. 6th is a wide receiver room that's not quite Ohio State's level, but close. It's deep. It's balanced. 7th is their athletic tight ends. 8th is their defensive back core, which makes plays when they matter. 9th is their linebackers. I love the story of Bryce Betcher, former walk-on. They're tough. They're disciplined. And 10th is the fact that Lanning's aggressive. He's been more aggressive than Day has this year, and that can sometimes be a bad thing. I mean, last year and in 2022, his aggression cost him more than it won him. This year, his aggression's paid off, Lanning's has, and he outcoached Day the first time around, and Lanning does whatever it takes to win. I don't know if I get that sense from Ryan Day, even though I still think he's a near elite head coach. So those are 10 reasons why I think both teams can win this game. Obviously, both teams can win this game. And that's what my model thinks, because my model thinks it is going to be a one-score game. Potential Power's prediction for this matchup is Oregon 29.7, so about 30 points. Ohio State 21.8 points, so about 22. And what Potential Power sees is that actually, contrary to the fact that Oregon may have a bad defense, at least at a playoff level, both of these defenses have matchup advantages here. And a big part of the reason why this is, in fact, is Ohio State's O-line and the lack of depth that it has. If Simmons and McLaughlin were both playing in this game like they were in October to start off, I know Simmons got hurt early in the game, Ohio State's offense would probably have a matchup edge over Oregon's defense. It'd be slight, because I think Oregon's defense is an overhated unit, but they would have something there. Now, Oregon's defense, even with some of its weaknesses, because of Ohio State's O-line and just the situation right there with Oregon's elite D-line, or at least a collection of many elite players, they have a matchup edge over Ohio State's offense. And while Ohio State should pass the ball relatively well, it's hard to be one-dimensional and score a bajillion points. It is. And Ohio State has gotten more one-dimensional as the season has gone on an average basis. Of course, like against Tennessee, they had success running the ball. A lot of that was Henderson getting, like 50 yards on 2 rushes for touchdowns, where his O-line did all right blocking for him. The second time around, they got no push. He just bounced to the outside because he's an alien. This is what I'm talking about, where Ohio State's players compensate for what is a bad offensive line. If Ohio State had, let's say, Judkins and Donovan Edwards, or if at wide receiver you replaced Jeremiah Smith with Julian Fleming, you would see what I'm talking about. Like those players, Ibuka, Smith, Henderson, Howard, they do a lot to compensate for this offensive line, which is poorly coached, poorly developed. Not an insult to the players, by the way. Good players. They play with heart. It's looking right at Justin Fry and saying, what are you doing right here? All that to say, Ohio State's quarterbacks and wide receivers, as we've said, they should do very well. I would be shocked if they didn't have a great game. Oregon, though, will be superior in running the ball, and I think Ohio State's rushing offense will be not taken out of the game entirely because I trust Henderson to make things happen, but they won't be much of a factor here. What this game is really going to be about is whether Ohio State, it's going to be very similar to the question between Penn State and Oregon the first time around, matchup-wise, not coaching-wise. There's no James Franklin level incompetence here in this matchup. The question is Is Ohio State's air attack that much superior to where it will negate Oregon's trench advantage? Because that was the case in the Big Ten Championship game, where Penn State was better in the trenches, but Oregon was so much better through the air that it didn't matter. And coaching played into that as well. So that's a question here that will determine the game, definitely. Is Ohio State's passing offense so elite that they can totally negate their trench disadvantage, even in a game like this? And if it is, they'll probably win, barring maybe Dan Lanning, doing a wonderful job out coaching Day, which I don't necessarily expect, because the first time Willie out coached him, it wasn't glaringly obvious until, well, it wasn't glaringly obvious at all. It's just at the end of the game, Lanning happened to be the better coach. But if the answer's no to that question, and Oregon's trench advantage matters more than Ohio State's air attack, then Oregon probably wins the game. And potential powers prediction also factors in, the fact that Oregon has more rest, which is a good thing, by the way. If you think it's a bad thing, then it should have been a bad thing for Ohio State against Tennessee, and it just straight up wasn't. Ohio State very much benefited from that extra preparation time and rest. And it also factors in the travel. So just about an 8-point win per potential power. That's pretty good. I mean, right there, should be a great game, one-score game. It should be lower scoring than last time because Ohio State's defense has improved since that Oregon game, but also Ohio State's offense has gotten worse. So that overall creates, I think, a lower scoring affair than what will happen the first time. And Ohio State's offensive line, particularly their losses there, but just overall their depth, I think, cripple them in a game like this. By cripple, I don't mean cripple them in that they're going to get blown out. They won't get blown out. I mean, I watched film. I did this deep dive here today, and I'm more confident that Oregon wins, but I am not confident that they win by more than anywhere from a field goal to a touchdown. I think Ohio State's a really, really good team. I think if Ohio State wins this game, they probably would be the favorites to win it all. Kirby Smart's a better coach than Day, but Ohio State has a much better roster right now. And while I think there's a shot that Notre Dame and Penn State could match up very well with Ohio State roster-wise, I also think that Day is a much better coach than Franklin, who has, I think, a roster matchup edge over OSU. And while I think Day is better than Freeman, though not to the same degree, with Riley Mills being lost for Notre Dame and Ohio State's rushing defense being as good as it is, I think that Ohio State could force Notre Dame to put the square block through the round hole all game long and just stalwart their offense. I think that there's no score revision needed. It will be a competitive game. The Ducks are just better and more balanced, and on top of that, they get a longer period to prepare for this game than Ohio State does. So with all that in mind, I still pick Oregon to win 31-24. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, and the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Carly Low H for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all-conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I will see you all very soon. Have a great day. Go Ducks. Go Buckeyes. Let's have a fantastic Rose Bowl.